Hello, my name is Angelina Harris, and today I will be examining Macbeth through the lens of New Historicism. Macbeth is a play deeply concerned with themes of ambition, treason, and political violence. At its center lies the shocking act of regicide, the murder of King Duncan by Macbeth. However, when we examine this tragedy through a New Historicist perspective, the play reveals itself as more than simply a personal story about ambition and guilt. Instead, it becomes a reflection of the political anxieties, cultural beliefs, and ideological structures of early 17th century England. New Historicism allows us to explore how literature interacts with the historical moment in which it was produced. Rather than viewing literary works as isolated artistic creations, this critical framework treats them as cultural artifacts shaped by the political, social, and ideological forces of their time. In this presentation, I will first introduce the core ideas behind New Historicism as a critical framework. Then, I will apply this approach to Macbeth by examining how the play reflects contemporary concerns about monarchy, witchcraft, political betrayal, and the disruption of natural order. In this analysis, when I say contemporary, I'm referring to the culture surrounding Shakespeare and the time in which this play was written. Finally, I will briefly discuss some limitations of the New Historicist approach. Through this analysis, we can see that Macbeth is not only a tragedy about individual ambition, but also a cultural response to fears about political instability and the consequences of challenging legitimate authority. So what is New Historicism? New Historicism is a form of literary criticism that emerged in the late 20th century and was strongly associated with scholars such as Stephen Greenblatt. This approach emphasizes the relationship between literature and the historical context in which it was produced. Rather than interpreting literary text as timeless works of art detached from history, New Historicism argues that literature is deeply embedded within cultural systems of power and ideology. According to this perspective, literary texts both reflect and shape the historical forces surrounding them. Writers are influenced by the political structures, cultural beliefs, and social tensions of their time. And their works often participate in broader cultural conversations about power, authority, and identity. Because of this, New Historicist critics treat literary works almost like historical documents. They examine how texts interact with real political events, social customs, and cultural anxieties. In other words, literature becomes a site where historical conflicts and ideological struggles are expressed and negotiated. So what are some core assumptions of New Historicism? New Historicism is based on several important assumptions. First, literature and history cannot be separated. Literary texts are produced within specific historical conditions, and understanding those conditions can help us better interpret the meaning of the work. Second, literary texts both reflect and shape cultural ideologies. This means that literature can reinforce dominant beliefs about society, but it can also question or complicate them. Third, existing power structures influence the production of literature. Writers often operate within systems of political and social authority, and those systems can shape the themes and messages present in literary works. Finally, New Historicists argue that historical narratives themselves are not neutral accounts of the past. Instead, they are constructed through cultural and ideological perspectives. These assumptions encourage critics to explore how literature participates in the broader cultural processes that shape society. So let's get into some major theoretical concerns of New Historicism. Because of these assumptions, New Historicists often focus on several key concerns when analyzing literature. One major concern is power and authority. Critics examine how texts represent political authority and how they respond to existing power structures. Another concern is political ideology, the beliefs and values that justify and maintain systems of authority. New Historicists also examine social hierarchy, looking at how literature portrays relationships between rulers and subjects, elites and commoners, and other forms of structured power. They also analyze cultural anxieties or the fears and tensions present within a society at a particular historical moment. Finally, New Historicists often explore the control of historical narratives, investigating how literature participates in shaping the way the world itself is understood. These concerns make New Historicism particularly useful when analyzing works like Macbeth, which deals directly with political authority, succession, and rebellion. Several key concepts guide New Historicist analysis. One important concept is discourse, which refers to the systems of language and ideas that shape how people think about power and authority within a society. Another key concept is ideology, which refers to the dominant beliefs that support and justify existing political and social structures. A third concept is power structure, which describes the systems through which authority is organized and maintained. When applied to literature, these concepts help critics examine how texts interact with the political and cultural forces shaping their historical moment. So when using this framework, critics often ask several guiding questions. In my own analysis, I will use the following questions to examine the play Macbeth. First, how does the text reflect the political and cultural tensions of the time? In other words, what contemporary ideology is present in Macbeth? Next, what contemporary anxieties are reflected in the narrative? In other words, what contemporary discourse is present in Macbeth? Finally, how does the text reinforce or challenge contemporary systems of authority? In other words, how do contemporary power structures influence the play? These questions will allow us to examine Macbeth not only as artistic expression, but also as part of a larger cultural conversation. So now let's get into the analysis. So using this framework, we can now examine how Macbeth reflects the political anxieties of its historical context. The play revolves around regicide, treason, and political betrayal, topics that would have been especially sensitive during the 17th century. At the beginning of the play, Macbeth begins to imagine the possibility of seizing the throne after hearing the witch's prophecy. He expresses his secret ambition when he says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." This line reveals that Macbeth immediately recognizes the dangerous nature of his thoughts. From a new historicist perspective, this moment reflects contemporary fears about hidden political ambition and betrayal within royal courts. So now let's look at the ideology of this time, looking specifically at the ideology of King James I. Understanding the historical context of this play is particularly important. Macbeth was written during the reign of King James I of England, who had recently ascended to the English throne after a period of political uncertainty. Queen Elizabeth I had no children, and England struggled to identify her heir. Mary I, Queen of Scots, who was James I's mother, reigned briefly before being dethroned and eventually executed. By the time James I ascended, England had gone through a quick succession of ever-changing monarchs and was reluctant to trust their new king. From a new historicist perspective, Macbeth may have been written as a defense of James I's legitimacy to the throne and as a subtle propaganda piece. James I was also a patron of Shakespeare's acting company, which raises interesting questions about how royal authority may have influenced the themes of the play. We'll get to more of those later. Because of this context, some scholars believe that Macbeth reinforces the legitimacy of the monarch and warns against rebellion. Another important historical factor involves the widespread fear of witchcraft during this period. King James I himself had a strong interest and almost obsession in the supernatural, and even wrote a book called Demonology, which argued that witchcraft was a real and dangerous threat. He referred to it as an act of Satan, and many of his like-minded contemporaries in England used this book to inspire widespread witch hunts and identify potential partakers of black magic. He also advocated for the harsh prosecution of those who participated in witchcraft. In 1604, he enacted the Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits. This act made witchcraft legally punishable by death. Within this cultural context, the witches in Macbeth would have appeared especially disturbing to audiences. Their presence introduces moral confusion and instability into the world of the play. When the witches encounter Macbeth, they say, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." The witches' influence suggests that supernatural forces are contributing to political disorder. While the witches clearly function as supernatural characters, their role can also be interpreted symbolically. From a new historicist perspective, the witches embody cultural fears about forces that threaten political stability. During the reign of James I of England, witchcraft was often associated with rebellion against divine and political authority. By presenting witches as figures who blur these moral boundaries, declaring that fair is foul and foul is fair, Shakespeare introduces a world where established hierarchies become unstable. Their prophecies do not directly force Macbeth to act, but they create a framework that allows his ambition to flourish. As servants of the occult and of Satan, they encourage him to go against God by committing murder against the king. This suggests that political chaos emerges not simply from supernatural influence, but from the interaction between external temptation and internal desire. In this way, the witches represent the destabilizing potential of ideological confusion. They challenge the clear distinctions between loyalty and treason, legitimacy and usurpation, thereby contributing to the breakdown of political order. From a new historicist perspective, the witches reflect contemporary anxieties about the danger of supernatural influence and the potential for chaos within the political order. Macbeth serves as a warning against the effects of unchecked witchcraft on society, giving King James I a stronger argument for prosecuting alleged witches in his time. So now let's get to the discourse of this play, what is present from the contemporary perspective. Another important belief during this period was the divine right of kings. This doctrine held that monarchs were chosen by God and therefore possessed sacred authority. Because of this belief, killing a king was not simply a political crime, it was considered a violation of divine order. Killing a king was a grave sin that would condemn the doer forever. However, as we know, Macbeth ignores this idea and murders Duncan anyway, committing a sin against God himself. This idea appears clearly after Duncan's murder, when Macbeth declares, "Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple." Here, Duncan's body is described as a sacred temple, reinforcing the idea that the king possesses divine status. To murder a king holds the same level of sacrilegious heresy as destroying a cathedral or a holy relic. Macbeth's crime therefore represents not only personal ambition, but also a profound disruption of political and spiritual order. The play also resonates with a major historical event known as the Gunpowder Plot. This was a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate King James I by blowing up Parliament. In doing this, they hoped to install a new Catholic king who would promote their belief system. The plot deeply shocked the English public and intensified fears about political treason. This act was simply more evidence of the political turmoil and upheaval England had already endured under previous monarchs. In the midst of the Protestant Reformation, changing monarchs meant changing religions, and each side of the movement repeatedly used this upheaval for their advantage. Interestingly, Shakespeare refers to an equivocation, a term associated with the conspirators who attempted to justify their deception. One character remarks, "Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales." This reference suggests that Shakespeare's audience would have been reminded of the recent plot against the king. In addition, Macbeth functions as an explicit warning against regicide. Not only are usurpers damned spiritually, but they're also doomed to fail politically. After murdering Duncan, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are led down a cursed path of destruction that ultimately leads to their own downfall. Violence begets violence until Macbeth's murder restores order to the chaos. From a new historicist perspective, the play can therefore be seen as reinforcing the dangers of political rebellion. This play would have certainly served as a humbling reminder to those who supported the Gunpowder Plot of what would await them in the future. So now let's look at that power structure that was evident through Macbeth that represented the power structure of his time, and how Macbeth reinforced that power structure. After Duncan's murder, the play depicts a series of strange events in the natural world. For example, one character remarks, "By the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles a traveling lamp." So we have already a depiction of chaos because night has replaced day. In addition, animals behave strangely, including a falcon that is mysteriously killed by an owl. A falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. This particular description is interesting because the mighty falcon is overthrown by a lowlier bird, a direct comparison to Macbeth's murder of Duncan. These unnatural events symbolize the collapse of political and cosmic order following the king's death. During the Renaissance, many thinkers believed in what was called the Great Chain of Being. This was a belief created by Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle. They believed in a hierarchical system that organized the universe from God to monarch to subjects to animals and so forth. When Macbeth kills Duncan, he disrupts this hierarchy, causing disorder not only in the political realm, but also in the natural world, in the universe itself. A world without respect for natural order leads to chaos, disaster, and ruin, as we see in Macbeth. Despite the chaos caused by Macbeth's actions, the play ultimately restores legitimacy and legitimate authority. The play dramatized rebellion, yet dissuades others from participating in it by showing that rebellion will always ultimately fail. Macbeth is defeated, and Malcolm is crowned King of Scotland. One character announces his victory by declaring, "Hail King, for so thou art. Behold where stands the usurper's cursed head." This ending reinforces the idea that rebellion against rightful authority will ultimately fail. In this sense, the play may function as a warning against political treason while reaffirming the legitimacy of monarchy. These dominant power structures at work in Shakespeare's time are reinforced and defended. So let's look at some of the limitations and strengths of New Historicism. Now, in my opinion, there are more limitations than there are strengths, but we'll get into that. Although New Historicism also offers valuable insights, it also has very many limitations. One strength of the approach is that it contextualizes literature within its historical moment and highlights the ways in which power and ideology shape artistic expression. Through reading contemporary works like Macbeth, we can get a glimpse into the cultural ideas and anxieties of Shakespeare's day. We get an idea of what life was like in England during the 17th century, which I think is pretty cool. However, some critics argue, and I would argue as well, that New Historicism places too much emphasis on historical context. By focusing only on the context in which the play was written, other interpretations that span time and cultures are ignored. In other words, the play loses relevance to modern audiences. What are we to take out of it if all that we take out of it is that King James I should be king? He's not our king today. By focusing primarily on political power structures, it may overlook other important aspects of literature, such as psychological complexity or artistic creativity. Additionally, New Historicism sometimes assumes that literary works merely reflect existing power structures rather than allowing for the possibility that authors may challenge or resist those structures. From a New Historicism perspective, it's easy to assume that King James I heavily influenced the writing of Macbeth. After all, he was a big patron of the arts and a patron of Shakespeare's work. However, this easy mistake undermines the creativity and autonomy of Shakespeare himself, who may not have even written this play specifically for the king. Another potential issue involves the selective use of historical evidence. Critics may focus only on historical details that support their interpretation while ignoring contradictory evidence. In my own research, I focused only on the applications of Macbeth within the context of King James I's reign. This narrow focus, of course, aided my argument and aided the completion of the assignment, but it also blinds me to other broader interpretations of the text. Finally, there is a risk of presentism, in which modern values are imposed into historical text in ways that distort their original context. When examining any piece of literature, it's impossible to completely remove any personal biases. 400 years after the play's conception, we have very different ideas about society, kingship, and religion. Divine right kings no longer hold power over us, especially here in the United States, and neither do superstitions or fears about the occult and witchcraft. As we examine historical text, we must be careful not to allow these biases from modern perspectives to influence our interpretations and ensure we fairly and accurately represent the ideas of the time. In conclusion, examining Macbeth through a New Historicist lens reveals how deeply the play is connected to the political and cultural anxieties of early 17th century England. Themes such as regicide, witchcraft, and the disruption of natural order reflect contemporary fears about rebellion, supernatural influence, and political instability. By situating the play within its historical context, we can better understand how Shakespeare's tragedy engages with real ideological concerns about monarchy and authority. Ultimately, Macbeth functions not only as a dramatic exploration of ambition and guilt, but also as a cultural response to the political tensions of its time. Through the framework of New Historicism, the play becomes a perfect and powerful example of how literature both reflects and participates in the historical forces that shape society.